guys, welcome back to my channel. It's me, Swastika, and today we will be discussing and continuing the discussion of yesterday. And before we do that, I just have two requests to make. Firstly, please press the subscribe button, that's the red button at the bottom of the screen. And second, I would request you to sort of play this video at a higher playback speed, but to watch it till the end, because if you stop in the middle, you'll just get confused. And definitely the next part of the video is a continuation of the previous part, so if you miss out on even one bit, the most of it will not make sense. So today we are going to basically discuss the same chapter from this book. This is my favorite book. It's the Oxford Companion to Politics, and we will be discussing the intellectual tradition and history of the evolution of political science, which is a chapter in this by Rudolph and Rudolph. So to begin off with, in the previous class we had extensively spoken about how the early part of the evolution of political science, the pre-independence and the early post-independence years, were heavily dominated by the British colonial rule. They completely controlled how we educated our children, how we educated ourselves. From Thomas Macaulay's 1835 minutes on education to a long time, even after independence, we were very much dominated by the colonial structure and the colonial way of thinking. In fact, that domination was so heavy that even till today, thinkers like Kaviraj and Ramachandra Guha talk about the continuation of a colonial mindset and how, though the dominance has changed, the hegemony hasn't. That's the post-colonial way of thinking, right? So the colonial thought process and how it impacted us, we have already discussed that, and the way that it made itself evident in the constitution writing practice was the early dominance of institutionalism. So today I will firstly be speaking about institutionalism, then we will be moving on to the next phase, which is behavioralism. Then we will go on to the modernization theory, which was introduced by Rajni Kothari in 1963, one of the most prominent Indian thinkers, and he's very important. His work is very important in terms of not just political science but for other papers as well. After that, we will be discussing identity politics, and lastly we will be discussing certain elements of post-colonial studies, which is the second generation of political scientists. So going back to the early institutionalism. So in the early institutionalism, the way we wrote our constitution, the way ideas were put forward was basically a remnant of the colonial structure. So David Apter had defined institutionalism as an exclusive approach in comparative politics up to World War II, which combined elements of political philosophy, natural law and history. So this was how we understood institutionalism. It made itself evident in the constitution writing process. So after this came the behavioral turn. We would not refer it to as a revolution, because it is still something which is getting continued even in India today. So we would put the word turn to it. So what is this behavioral turn? So this behavioral turn and behavioralism was essentially a mind child of Jawaharlal Nehru, who wanted to infuse the concepts of modernity into the traditional way of thinking. So what this basically meant was that when we spoke about social sciences or when we spoke about political science, we were no longer following the dominant traditional trend. We were in fact now focusing more on the scientific aspect of the job. So this made itself evident because the social scientists would no longer be living in their ivory towers and talking theoretical concepts which did not connect well with in the grassroots level, but were in fact stepping down into the field to study things from a first-hand perspective and to draw inferences and observations by conducting a field survey. So this is also something which is called ethnography. We talked about this in the previous class, in which we try to sort of get down to the field and we try to do a grassroots level survey by being at one with the subject that we are studying. So this behavioral turn happened. It had a very important implication in the sense that the caste hegemony of the Brahminical hold over the intellectual tradition sort of broke, right? So that happened, and that's important because that was only because of the infiltration of science into breaking the handhold of traditions that we could in fact see the Brahminical hegemony over intellectualism sort of breaking. Kothari, who in 1963 launched CSTS. So why is Rajni Kothari important? He's important because he was one of the foremost thinkers who could give competition to bigger thinkers abroad, right? And also he did he studied from London School of Economics, and Rajni Kothari also had the distinction of bringing the modernization theory to India. So modernization theory, as a disciple of Gabriel Almond, who was big in comparative politics and into the idea of structural functionalism, Rajni Kothari sort of got ideas from him and brought in the idea of structural functionalism into India. So this structural functionalism was basically or modernization theory, which was introduced by Rajni Kothari to us, was something which was developed by Talcott, Parsons and Edward Shills in 1951 in their work which is called Towards a General Theory of Action. Right, so Rajni Kothari is important in this sense, so we just have to keep that in mind. Right, so moving on, when we trace the evolution, we see that during the Cold War there were heightened tensions between India and USA because Nixon in 1971 had sort of supported Pakistan. So some of these tensions also seeped and made their way into academics, which led to which basically gave a more Western orientation to political science, which Rajni Kothari sort of apologized for later. Right, so moving on, we are going to discuss the fourth part of the evolution of political science, where we discuss things like identity politics. So whenever we use the term identity politics, we mostly refer to Charles Taylor's work on recognition. The crux of his work is that we tend to internalize a negative self-image when somebody talks negatively about us. So if I am a minority community and somebody has created a negative perception about me, eventually I will sort of internalize this negative self-image, and what I think of myself would be what the majoritarian view has been about me till now. So this was the basic idea, and this was encapsulated in two ways. The first way was in Dalit studies. So in 1990s, from the beginning of 1990s, Dalit politics sort of took a spin-off in India. Thanks to Rajni Kothari once again, who sort of brought in this idea of caste in politics, and which later led to the further development of Dalit politics in 1990. And the second idea, which relates to identity politics, is about languages. So in the State Reformation Act, more states were carved out of old ones. This in fact led to a greater unity, and this heterogeneity actually helped us in the long run and helped people get along with each other better, because linguistic differences are also a major difference which we need to understand and appreciate. We cannot uniformly impose one language on the entire nation and accept there not to be people to not have problems with it, right? So the last part that we are going to discuss is the post-colonial mindset, which is something that has famously been brought in by thinkers like Partha Chatterjee, who talks about a derivative discourse, and thinkers like Sudipta Kaviraj, who talks about a post-colonial mindset. and also guhas. So these thinkers we can study in great detail, but I was just telling you the evolution of political science. So these are the five frames of structures that I have tried to bring in. The first is the early dominance of pre-colonial dominance of the colonial masters. The second is the institutional framework that we talked about, how that seeped into the process of constitution writing. The third is the behavioral turn that sort of took place when Jawaharlal Nehru was there and we wanted a more scientific approach to things. And the fourth that we talked about was the modernization theory, which was put forward by Rajni Kothari, who got the idea from Gabriel Almond and Talcott Parsons when he was in Stanford. And the next thing we talked about was identity politics, where again we discussed two things: one, Dalit politics, and one, politics on the basis of linguistic differences, how that came into being and what were the implications of these politics becoming a major part of the political discourse, right? And lastly we discussed post-colonial studies, which is basically something which is being taken forward by thinkers like Partha Chatterjee, Sadhutta Kaviraj, so on and so forth. So this was the basic crux of the thing. And if you want my notes, you can contact me. I'll put the address down below. And thank you for listening to me.